In this video, we'll dive into my experiments and explore the science behind New York style cheesecake and its texture. But what is a cheesecake? Why is it so sensitive to temperature fluctuations? Why do we have to bake it so carefully compared to other desserts? This video is a response to a comment I got from a poll last year for video requests. Great suggestion, by the way. So I'm gonna look at trying to understand and perfecting that creamy cheesecake texture and how that relates to temperature. Do cheesecakes have to be baked a certain way? What happens when we swap out ingredients? And how will I use all this information to build my perfect cheesecake recipe? Cheesecakes are a type of, well, this particular cheesecake is a type of baked custard. And by definition, custards contain a main dairy ingredient, such as milk or cream, and it's often thickened with eggs. And sometimes it uses flour, cornstarch, or gelatin for added structure. Although there are different types of cheesecake custards, this variation uses cream cheese as the primary dairy ingredient. And categorizing this dessert as a baked custard will give me a better initial understanding of each ingredient's role in getting the proper cheesecake texture. Now I'm using New York style to describe the type of thick and creamy cheesecakes and to differentiate it from, say, the Japanese cotton souffle-like cheesecakes, which are much lighter, or the charred exterior Basque cheesecakes. Let me briefly show you how I did my experiments. I hacked together a little setup in my oven to allow me to constantly monitor the temperature changes without opening the oven door all the time, which would cause fluctuations in the temperature and not give me an accurate bake time. I have a probe on this rack, which is this gal right here, and she measures the air temperature. Then I have two probe style couplers, and I have two because they each take measurements a little bit differently, so I just take the average of the two. Then, whenever I needed to run a test, I would open the oven, slide the cheesecake underneath the setup, and then gently place the sensors in the direct center of each custard while they baked. The temperature data then gets recorded, which I can then export and turn into graphs. Now, this setup is going to allow me to look at the temperature changes for every single cheesecake that I bake and how that relates to the baking method and the ingredients and their ratios. So first, I'm going to take a closer look at the baking method. So for my experiments, I developed a base recipe to test. And my explanation for this was much longer than I expected it to be, so I'm cutting that part out since it went too deep into the general literature review process that I do for recipe development. The gist of it is that I analyze established recipes to determine relative concentrations of things like proteins and starches and fat. Then I adjust based on the texture or flavor or the look that I want. Here are the ratios I came up with for my base recipe, which I'll reference throughout my experiments. Cheesecakes can have what I call a texture gradient, meaning there's a difference in texture from one part of the cheesecake to another. And that texture depends on the final temperature of your cheesecake. Now, this is something you can tailor to your liking based on how you bake your cheesecake. So for this experiment, I took my base recipe and made 4 mini 4-inch cheesecakes. After baking, each cheesecake was allowed to cool gradually in the oven with the heat turned off for about 30 minutes. I then measured the temperature of the direct center and outer edge to determine the texture gradient or the difference in temperature between the two areas. The only difference between the 4 is how I baked them. Take a look at the difference in the bake times. The first one was a low temperature cheesecake, and it was baked at 200 degrees Fahrenheit and took about 89 minutes to reach an internal temperature of 160 Fahrenheit. The second was a moderate temperature cheesecake baked at 300 Fahrenheit. That one took about 37 minutes to bake. The third cheesecake was baked at a pretty high temperature, 400, and took only 23 minutes to bake. And the last cheesecake, I wanted to see the effects of a water bath, and this one was baked in the water bath and baked at 350. The final bake time for this one was 37 minutes. And although it sounds tempting to choose the higher temperatures to cook them more quickly, what do you think happens to the texture gradient as you increase the temperature? So let's find out. The low temperature cheesecake had a final temperature of 165 and an edge at 168 with a difference of only 3 degrees. And because of the small gradient, there was little difference in the texture from the direct center to the edge. It was soft and creamy throughout with no discernible grainy texture from any part of the cheesecake. Now this cheesecake remained relatively pale on top, and a really helpful thing to learn as a baker is that heat-based browning reactions, which are the Maillard reaction and caramelization, which do understandably get mistakenly exchanged for one another, although they are completely different reactions. But the thing you need to know is that these reactions don't occur until the temperatures reach much higher, around 300 to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you have a cheesecake that bakes at a lower temperature and you want that nice kind of toasty look on top, pop it back in the oven at a higher temperature. Just make sure to keep an eye on it so that you don't over bake that nice creamy interior. Well, what about the moderate temperature cheesecake? That one had a center of 165 and an edge at 183. This gives us an 18-degree difference, which in turn causes a greater texture gradient. There was a soft, creamy center with the edges baking up discernibly firmer. At around 185, we're right at the edge of feeling grainy and crumbly. Although it wasn't terrible, I definitely thought it was just on the verge of being too dry, but it was still really nice. And it makes sense that the edges would be like this. They're in direct contact with the metal pan and therefore will cook faster than the center due to the metal's superior heat conductivity. The exposed surface was dry and formed almost like a skin-like layer. The high temperature cheesecake had the largest texture gradient, with the center at 165 and the edges reaching 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And a clear sign that a cheesecake has been baked at a high temperature is that it has raised edges compared to the center. This means that the gas expansion due to heat is happening faster than the cheesecake's ability to set, resulting in a texture that kind of is like a firmer cheese, like a Stilton, kind of crumbly like that. This really wasn't pleasant to eat, and there's only a small portion of the center that remained creamy. Now, these high temperatures are edging into Basque cheesecake territory, as you can see by the slight browning on the surface and edges. However, this one isn't quite there yet because the magic of a Basque cheesecake lies in achieving the perfect texture gradient. It's a bit of a balancing act because the correct oven temperature is needed to push the Maillard and caramelization reactions on the surface and minimize over-coagulating the custard at the edges, while at the same time barely reaching the minimum setting temperature for the center. If I ever get into developing my own Basque cheesecake recipes for this small size in particular, I'd likely need to bake it at an even higher temperature to get the desired result. And what about the last one, the water bath cheesecake? This one had an interior of 165 and an edge of 185, so 20-degree difference. And this one had a very similar texture gradient to the moderate heat cheesecake baked at 300 with the distinct creamy center and firmer edge. The main difference between those two is that this cheesecake did not have any dryness or that kind of thin skin layer on the top of the exposed surface, but remained soft and creamy. So why even bother with a water bath if it's almost the same as the moderate 300 cheesecake? Water baths are a very common method for anything that needs to bake very slowly and gradually, such as a cheesecake custard. And you can think of a water bath in the context of cheesecakes as like buying insurance. You invest a little bit of effort up front for peace of mind later. The premium that you pay is the extra step of setting up the water bath, wrapping your cheesecake pan to prevent leaks, and dealing with a bit more prep work. In return, your cheesecake can be more protected from temperature spikes, which ensures a slow, even bake. But what does immersing something in water and placing it in a hot oven actually do? Well, water is pretty special amongst the types of substances that we work with in baking because it takes a lot of energy to heat up, and this occurs relatively slowly. Along the same lines, it also transfers heat very slowly. This is called specific heat capacity, which is a way to measure how much heat a substance can hold before it gets hotter. In baking and cooking, specific heat capacity is so important. Now, you don't need to remember any of the numbers in this graph. We're not solving equations and things like that. But generally, it's a good idea to know that anything that has a lot of water in it or is cooked in water is going to take longer to bake than, say, something that has more air in it or is cooked in air. For example, say you have a sponge cake or an angel food cake, which has a lot of air in it. That's going to take a lot less time to bake than a similar volume of cheesecake, which has more water in it. For custards like cheesecakes, slow and gentle is ideal. Okay, remember that baked cheesecakes are custards, which means that their primary structure source comes from egg proteins. And when these egg proteins are baked, they coagulate. And that means that the proteins unfold and bond together to form a soft gel-like structure. And the reason why these types of cheesecakes are so sensitive regarding temperature is that they contain a relatively low percentage of those egg-based proteins. And because they're interlaced with sugar and fat. Now, the sugar and fat molecules work by interfering with the extent to which these proteins can coagulate or bond with each other. And that ensures that we get a creamy, soft mouthfeel when these cheesecakes are baked. Regulating the temperature of the custard is very important. Too little heat and therefore not enough coagulation, and your cheesecake won't set. Too much heat and the proteins will over-coagulate or intertwine with each other too much, causing the custard to pull in some areas and ultimately crack in the looser ones. Now, the exact coagulation or setting temperature for your cheesecake is going to depend on a couple things. There's the protein content of your cheesecake, and then there are the sugar and fat levels, and that's going to cause that temperature to fluctuate between recipe to recipe. A good guideline I like to follow is that the USDA recommends we cook foods that contain eggs to a minimum of 160 Fahrenheit. On the other hand, there's a general consensus that these types of custards will start to crack at 185 Fahrenheit. So if you stay within that range, you should be okay. I like to err on the lower side of that. So I typically remove my cheesecakes when they're about 155 because after they sit in the oven for a little bit, they raise in temperature about 5 degrees. So that brings me up to 160 and that gives me that nice creamy interior. But yeah, 160 to 185 should be okay. Next, I'm going to look at what I call the secondary. And this is because there's typically in New York style cheesecakes a second type of dairy ingredient that's used in the recipe for flavor and for acidity. So if you want to change those characteristics around, it also changes a little bit of the texture. So with this experiment, I took my base recipe and baked them all the same way, which is low and slow at 200, and varied the secondary. I chose sour cream and heavy cream as those two are probably the most common, and I also tested low-fat Greek yogurt and mascarpone. A quick, interesting observation was that switching out the secondary in cheesecakes alters the baking time. For my 4-inch mini cheesecakes, sour cream and Greek yogurt were baked similarly, finishing at around 83 minutes to reach an internal temp of 160, and the cheesecakes containing heavy cream and mascarpone finished quicker, taking only 63 minutes. If I told you that sour cream and Greek yogurt cheesecakes contained more water and less fat, and that the heavy cream and mascarpone cheesecakes were higher in fat with less water, why do you think the high fat cheesecakes baked quicker than the high water cheesecakes? So remember the specific heat capacity I was telling you about earlier? Well, here's a real world example of it. Water takes longer to heat up than fat. So even though it's such a small substitution, it does make a difference. Okay, so now let's get into the specifics on the flavor and textural changes. The sour cream cheesecake created the most classic cheesecake flavor. It had a heightened acidity from the lactic acid coming from both the cream cheese and sour cream, and that helps with the sweetness and toning it down a little bit more. So you're gonna look for a cheesecake that has sour cream in it if you favor acidity, or if you want to pair it with a super sweet topping, because acidity can balance out sweetness. And this cheesecake also had a slightly lighter texture without an overwhelmingly fatty feel to it. Moving on to heavy cream, which increases the fat content and removes the extra acidity. This cheesecake favors the pure flavor of cream cheese and heightens the sweetness a little bit. It has a thickness and a fattiness that pleasantly coats your tongue. It's very creamy and nice in texture. So look for a cheesecake recipe that has heavy cream in it if you like just the flavor of the cream cheese with a more decadent texture. The low-fat Greek yogurt cheesecake is a little bit less acidic than the sour cream one, so it tastes a bit sweeter. The texture for this one is less thick, but it's still a very substantial cheesecake, and it could be very good for people who prefer a lighter texture New York style cheesecake. The mascarpone cheesecake had the highest fat content and is very decadent and thick. It's got this wonderful nuttiness and earthiness from the mascarpone. It brings an almost savory umami undertone. So along those lines of umami, a mascarpone type cheesecake would go really well with nut pralines or something like a caramel. And the last experiment I wanted to quickly look at was the presence of starch in a cheesecake, or flour, and what that did to the texture. And you may have noticed that in my base recipe, I didn't add any starch like wheat flour or cornstarch. So I wanted to see if adding it made any difference. So I tested wheat flour and cornstarch at 2% of the total recipe. And I had one cheesecake that didn't have any starch in it to serve as my control, or what I compare the others to. The all-purpose flour adds a touch of thickness in almost a gluey, stretchy way compared to the control, and it didn't seem to have any impact on the flavor or bake time. The cornstarch was nearly identical with a little bit more gluiness. That's probably because I used the same amount of flour and cornstarch in these experiments, and cornstarch is a little bit stronger than regular wheat flour. Again, there's no impact on flavor or bake time. The good thing is that if you have a recipe that uses all-purpose flour and are looking to make your cheesecake gluten-free, cornstarch will work with very little adverse effects. Starches or flours are often added to cheesecakes to create stability and structure, and they work by thickening excess water and yielding a firmer, sliceable texture. Now, with most custards like flan or creme brulee, the structure mainly comes from coagulated egg proteins. In my experience, the main exception to this is pastry cream, which almost always includes either wheat flour or cornstarch to give it extra body and stability. That said, starch isn't always necessary in cheesecake. Because cream cheese is the primary dairy ingredient, it's going to bring some structure. During cream cheese manufacturing, stabilizers called gums are added to thicken and add viscosity to the cream cheese. These are also called hydrocolloids and don't act identically to starches. One example here is that they can exhibit thixotropic behavior, meaning if you shake it, the thickening properties lessen, giving the food a runny texture, as you can see here in the Chick-fil-A sauce. It's also why most cream cheese containing frostings get really runny if you overmix them. Still, I wouldn't shy away from a cheesecake that includes a starch. A well-made starch gel can be just as sturdy and even mimic the mouthfeel of a protein-based gel. And a recent example of this is J. Kenji Lopez Alt's scrambled eggs. He was inspired by Mandy Lee of Lady and Pups, and it's a really effective recipe because it uses a starch gel to create a soft, custardy texture in the scrambled eggs. And the same concept can apply to a cheesecake. When done right, the starch can help achieve that creamy, dreamy cheesecake texture. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that cheesecake journey. That was a lot of information. Would you believe me if I told you that I had to cut out so much of the video because it was getting so long? Anyways, if you're interested in applying any of this information and knowledge, check down below the video where I'll have links to my recipes. Happy making!